All right, now let's see how we can use data binding to implement the same behavior. Data binding is a concept that you see in a lot of UI frameworks like WPF and Silverlight, and even in web applications we have frameworks like Angular and Knockout and many others that provide this concept of data binding. Basically, what it means is that we bind a property of a user interface element to a property of another object. In this case, we want to bind the text property of the label to the value property of the slider. So when the value of the slider changes, the text property of the label is automatically updated. With this, we don't have to manually handle the value change event of a slider, which means we don't need to create this event handler either. So our code would be cleaner and more maintainable. Internally, the framework itself will create this event handler based on our binding expression. So let's see how we can do this. First of all, I'm going to remove this event handler. And back in XAML, I'm also going to remove the value changed attribute of slider. Now, we want to bind the text property of the label to the value property of the slider. So we need to use a special syntax for this. So far, all the attribute values you have seen have been strings. At runtime, these strings are converted to a primitive type or an object using a type converter. In case of data binding, we cannot convert a string value to a binding expression. That's why we need a special syntax, and in XAML, this is called XAML markup extensions. So we use curly braces to instruct XAML parser that this is not a string literal, and it's a markup extension. There are many different markup extensions available in XAML, and in this video, you're going to learn two of them. The first one is binding. So curly braces binding. Now, to set up binding, we need to specify what object we want to bind the text property to. So we set source to. Now here we want a reference to the slider object. That's when we use another markup extension. So again, curly braces. Now this markup extension is called xReference. So x:\reference. And we use that to reference another object in this XAML file. Note that it's prefixed with x, which means this belongs to the standard XAML that Microsoft introduced in year 2009. If you work with other XAML-based frameworks like WPF or Silverlight, you would see this. Now, after xReference space, we need to specify the name of the target element. In this case, slider. And this is based on the value of xName attribute. All right, so here's the source object. Now, what property of this object are we interested in? The value property, which represents the current value. So, after source, comma, path equals value. We call this path instead of property because that property itself may be an object, and we may want to use the dot notation to access another property like a.b.c. That's why it's called path. All right, that's pretty much all we have to write. Now, if I run this app, this is what we get. Note the label. Previously, we formatted this number with 2 digits after the decimal point. So let's go ahead and do this. Back here. So in our binding expression, we have set up source, path, and now the third property, string format, equals, and we use single quotes to differentiate from double quotes for the value of the text attribute. Now here, we supply a standard C# string format. So value is curly braces, 0 represents the first argument, colon F2 for formatting. Now let me break this up into multiple lines. Okay, this is cleaner and more maintainable. Now let's run the application again. Okay, that's exactly like before.